March 7, 1945, Remagen, Germany. 3:50 p.m., a single stone bridge over the Rhine stands intact, while every other crossing for 200 miles lies in ruin. The Ludendorff Bridge. Named for a general who never saw it completed, built in the First World War when Germany needed rails to push troops west, now the last thread connecting a collapsing Reich to the armies bleeding backward across the river. One bridge, 85 feet above fast water, and in 4 hours it will decide whether the war ends in April or drags into summer. But first, it has to survive the next 10 minutes. The scout's name was Karl Timmermann, though calling him that misses the point. He wasn't reconnaissance. He was a first lieutenant in the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, and on this Thursday afternoon his job wasn't to find bridges. It was to probe the town of Remagen for resistance, report back, and wait for orders. That isn't what happened. Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division had been moving fast since crossing the Rhine River that morning. Fast for March 1945 meant 12 miles in 6 hours, slowed by refugees, by SS rearguards, by roads chewed into mud under the treads of 60-ton Pershings that couldn't reverse without help. The division wasn't supposed to be here at all. First Army had tasked them with clearing the Cologne Plain, a broad sweep south of the city to compress the pocket, nothing glamorous. Bridges were not the mission. The Rhine crossings were scheduled for late March further north, under Montgomery, with planning staffs and smoke generators and enough artillery to flatten Jericho twice. This was a spoiling movement, a cleanup until someone saw the bridge. Timmermann's platoon rolled into the hills above Remagen just after 3 in the afternoon. The town clung to the west bank like barnacles, narrow streets terraced into the slope, and through a gap in the smoke they saw it. The Ludendorff, still standing, not damaged, not sagging, standing. For 5 months, not one bridge over the Rhine had survived. Wesel, Cologne, Düsseldorf, Mainz. Every crossing blown by Wehrmacht engineers as the Allies closed in, dropping spans into the current before the first American tank could touch the approach. Standard doctrine. Bridges were demolished on order, usually with enough lead time to move the explosives into place, connect the circuits, and fire the charges from a safe distance. The Wehrmacht wasn't sentimental about infrastructure. But here it stood. Timmermann didn't radio back to ask permission. He looked at his platoon sergeant, a man named Delisio, who'd been with him since Normandy, and said 3 words. "We're taking it." The decision violated protocol in at least 4 ways. He didn't have orders. He didn't have engineer support. He didn't have smoke, air cover, or artillery on call. What he had was 36 men, a handful of Browning automatic rifles, and about 6 minutes before someone on the far side remembered the detonator. But first, the town. Remagen wasn't empty. It was dying, but not empty. Civilians pressed into doorways, faces blank with exhaustion, and somewhere in the blocks between the hill and the riverfront, SS demolition teams were supposed to be rigging the charges. Supposed to be. The reality was messier. By early March, the German command structure in the west had collapsed into chaos. Units fought without supply lines. Orders arrived hours late or not at all. The 67th Corps, responsible for this sector, had been shattered in the fighting around the Aar, and the remnants were streaming east with whatever equipment they could carry. Captain Willy Bragg commanded the local defense. He had fewer than 500 men, most of them Volkssturm, old men and teenagers with 3 weeks of training and rifles that jammed in the cold. His orders were contradictory. Hold the bridge open for retreating units, but be ready to demolish it on 15 minutes' notice. He'd been awake for 36 hours. The explosives were in place, planted weeks earlier when demolition was still a theoretical contingency. 600 kilograms of TNT packed into chambers drilled into the stone piers, connected by wire to a command post in the East Tower. The circuits had been tested in February. They'd worked then. But that was February. Now it was March, and the damp had gotten into everything. Timmermann's platoon moved downhill in a column, boots loud on cobblestones, no suppressing fire, because they didn't know where the enemy was. Every window was a question mark. Every cellar door could hide a Panzerfaust. They didn't take fire until they reached the esplanade. The bridge approach opened into a small plaza on the west bank, a formal space that had once been landscaped, now pocked with shell craters and strewn with wire. The towers on either end rose like sentries, stone pillars reinforced with concrete, each one housing a stairwell that spiraled up to the rail deck. Between those towers and the first steel span, 70 yards of open ground, no cover, and at 4:02 p.m., someone pulled the trigger. The explosion came from mid-span, not under the bridge, on it. A single charge, poorly placed or poorly wired, blew a crater in the wooden planking but left the steel trusses intact. Smoke rolled across the deck, dense and black, and for 10 seconds, no one on the American side could see if the bridge was still there. Timmermann didn't wait for the smoke to clear. He ran, not alone. Delizio and a private named Massey followed, then 4 more, then the rest of the platoon in a stumbling rush across the esplanade and onto the span. The bridge wasn't level. It sloped upward toward the center, and the wooden deck had gaps now where the blast had peeled away planks, exposing the rail ties underneath. They ran in single file. Small arms fire snapped from the east tower, high and wild, fired by engineers who'd never trained for infantry work. One round clipped the stone railing and sprayed Timmermann's face with grit, but he kept moving, boots pounding timber, breath coming hard in the cold air. The bridge shook. Not from footsteps, from something heavier. The second charge. This one was under the span, planted against the pier on the east side, 200 kilograms of TNT wired to a plunger detonator in the tower above. If it blew clean, it would drop the center span into the Rhine and take every man on the bridge with it. But it didn't blow clean. The charge fired. The explosion was enormous, loud enough to shatter windows in Remagen a quarter mile away, but the blast vented downward into the river instead of shearing through the pier. The bridge lurched, visibly sagged, then held. 70 feet below, the Rhine absorbed the shock and kept moving. Timmermann was past midspan when it happened. He felt the lurch through his boots, thought for half a heartbeat that he was going into the water, then realized he was still upright. Behind him, men were shouting, but the words didn't register. Only one thing mattered: the far side. The east tower was 10 yards ahead. The door at its base stood open, and through it, Timmermann could see movement, a shadow, a flash of Feldgrau, someone still inside. He didn't slow down. He hit the door with his shoulder, carbine up, and found himself in a stairwell barely wide enough for 2 men abreast. Above him, footsteps clattered on stone as the engineers retreated upward, abandoning the detonator because the charges were already spent and staying meant capture. Timmermann let them go. He stepped out onto the east bank at 4:06 p.m. Behind him, the rest of the platoon poured across the bridge in a ragged line, fanning out along the rail embankment to secure the approach. One squad pushed into the tower to clear the upper floors. Another dug in along the tree line 30 yards back, setting up fields of fire in case the Germans counterattacked. They didn't. Not immediately. For 15 minutes, the east bank of the Rhine was the quietest place in Germany. Then, the rest of Combat Command B arrived. The word traveled fast. By 4:30, every radio in the division was crackling with the news. Bridge intact at Remagen. By 5, Corps Headquarters knew. By 6, it had reached Hodges at 1st Army, then Bradley at 12th Army Group, then Eisenhower himself at Schaff, forward in Reims. Eisenhower's reaction was immediate. Exploit it. Get everything across before the Germans wake up. He meant everything. By nightfall, 5,000 men and 50 tanks had crossed the Ludendorff. By midnight, engineers were building a pontoon bridge alongside it in case the stone span collapsed. By dawn, the entire 9th Armored Division was over the river, digging in on the heights above Herpel, establishing a bridgehead 6 miles wide and 2 miles deep. The Germans tried to destroy it. Over the next 10 days, the Luftwaffe flew over 200 sorties against the bridge, the most concentrated German air effort since the Battle of Britain. They used everything: Stukas, FW-190 fighter bombers, even the new Arado 234 jet, which could outrun any Allied interceptor but carried too small a bomb load to crack the span. The jet attacks came at dusk, when the light was worst for anti-aircraft gunners. The Arados screamed in at 400 miles per hour, dropped their bombs from 2,000 feet, and were gone before the Bofors crews could track them. They scored near misses, blew craters in the approaches, killed engineers working on the pontoons. But they didn't hit the bridge. The problem wasn't accuracy. The problem was physics. A 500-pound bomb, even a direct hit, wasn't enough to collapse a structure built to carry steam locomotives. You needed a bigger weapon, or more time, or both. The Germans had neither. They tried V-2 rockets, 11 of them, fired from mobile launchers in Holland, and aimed at the coordinates of the bridge. The V-2 was the most advanced weapon in the German arsenal, a liquid-fueled ballistic missile that could reach 4 times the speed of sound and strike without warning. Not one hit within 1,000 yards. The guidance system couldn't compensate for wind over that distance, and the targeting data was based on peacetime maps that didn't account for the bend in the river. The rockets fell into fields, into the town, into the Rhine itself, killing civilians and cows but leaving the bridge untouched. They tried frogmen, Kriegsmarine combat swimmers sent downriver at night with limpet mines, but the current was too strong, and the Americans had strung nets across the piers. 3 teams attempted the swim. None reached the bridge. 2 were captured, 1 drowned. They tried artillery, long-range guns firing from positions east of the Wide, but counter-battery fire from American 155s silenced them within hours. They tried infiltration teams, commandos with explosives, but the bridgehead was too dense, the perimeter too tight. Everything failed, not for lack of effort, for lack of time. The bridgehead expanded faster than the Germans could react. On March 8th, the perimeter was 2 miles deep. By March 10th, it was 6. By March 12th, American patrols were operating 10 miles east of the Rhine, cutting roads, overrunning supply dumps, spreading panic through rear area units that had never expected to see enemy tanks on this side of the river. The Wehrmacht was collapsing, not surrendering, collapsing. There's a difference. Surrender implies a decision, a moment when commanders weigh options and choose capitulation. Collapse is structural. It's when the machine stops working because too many parts are missing, when orders don't reach units because the radios are dead and the runners are lost and the staff officers are fleeing east in stolen trucks. The Remagen bridgehead accelerated that collapse. Before March 7th, the Rhine was a line the Germans could defend. It wasn't impregnable, but it was real. A physical barrier that forced the Allies to pause, to plan, to gather resources. Every day the line held was a day to move factories deeper into Germany, to conscript another age cohort, to hope that political fractures between the Western Allies and the Soviets might create an opening for negotiation. After March 7th, the line was gone. The bridgehead was a salient driven into the heart of the German defensive system, and it couldn't be sealed. The Wehrmacht threw everything available at it. Understrength divisions pulled from quiet sectors, Kampfgruppen assembled from depot troops and alarm units, even a few Tiger tanks scraped together from repair shops. None of it was enough. By March 15th, the bridgehead was 15 miles deep and growing. 3 American corps were across, 3rd Corps, 5th Corps, and elements of 7th Corps, over 100,000 men with armor and artillery and air support that the Germans could no longer match. And on March 17th, the Ludendorff collapsed. Not from bombs or sabotage, but from metal fatigue, accumulated stress from the original demolition charges, and the weight of constant traffic. The center span gave way at 3 in the afternoon, dropping into the Rhine with a roar that echoed off the valley walls. 28 engineers died in the collapse, men from the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion working on the deck to reinforce the weakened sections who didn't have time to run when the steel started screaming. They went into the river with the span, and the current took them before the rescue boats could get close. But by then it didn't matter. 6 pontoon bridges and 2 treadway spans were already in place. The bridgehead was 15 miles deep. 3 corps had crossed, over 80,000 men, and the Rhine was no longer a barrier. It was a memory. The Germans shot the engineer who failed to blow the bridge. His name was Captain Willy Bratke, and he commanded the rear area security detachment responsible for Remagen's defenses. After the collapse, he was court-martialed, convicted of cowardice, and executed by firing squad in a forest clearing east of Koblenz. 4 other officers died with him. The judgment was that they had failed to destroy the bridge in time, that they had panicked, that their incompetence handed the Allies a gateway into the Ruhr. This was not entirely fair. Bratsch had received contradictory orders throughout the day. Higher command wanted the bridge held open for retreating units as long as possible, then demolished at the last possible moment. The explosives were in place, But the Detonation Authority kept shifting between local commanders and distant headquarters, none of whom could agree on the right moment. When Timmermann's platoon appeared on the west bank, Bratsch had about 4 minutes to decide. He chose to blow the bridge immediately. The charges didn't work. Not because of faulty wiring, though. That's what the court-martial claimed. The TNT was old, stored in damp bunkers since 1944, and the blasting caps had corroded. When the plunger dropped, some charges fired, others didn't, and the ones that did weren't enough to drop the span. But courts-martial don't care about corrosion. They care about results. 5 men died in that clearing because a bridge stayed up. Bratsch's execution was ordered by Field Marshal Model, commander of Army Group B, who understood that the bridgehead was a catastrophe but needed someone to blame. Model was a careful officer, meticulous in planning, ruthless in execution. He'd stabilized collapsing fronts before, in Normandy after the breakout, in the Ardennes after the bulge flattened. But this was different. The bridgehead wasn't a tactical problem. It was strategic. It unhinged the entire defensive line, forced Model to redeploy divisions he couldn't spare, exposed the Ruhr to encirclement from the south. He knew it was over. He knew the war was lost. But he shot Bratsch anyway, because the alternative was admitting that the Wehrmacht no longer controlled events, that the machine had broken, that individual failures no longer mattered because the whole structure was coming apart. Shooting Bratsch was a statement that discipline still existed. It didn't. 6 weeks later, used his service pistol in a forest near Duisburg, surrounded by the ruins of Army Group B, choosing a bullet over captivity. He left no note. He didn't need to. The Ruhr pocket had surrendered 4 days earlier, 300,000 men walking into prisoner cages because there was no ammunition left, and no reason to die for a government that existed only in a bunker under Berlin. Timmermann didn't attend Bratsch's trial. By the time the captain faced the firing squad, the 27th Armored Infantry was 60 miles deeper into Germany, fighting through the Ruhr pocket, too busy to reflect on what had happened at Remagen. He received the Distinguished Service Cross in April, presented by Eisenhower himself during a ceremony in a muddy field near Limburg. The citation called his actions extraordinary heroism and noted that he'd secured the only intact Rhine bridge through initiative and aggressive leadership. He didn't keep the medal on him. He mailed it home to his wife in Nebraska, along with a letter that mentioned the bridge only in passing. He wrote more about the weather, about the countryside, about a dog his platoon had adopted somewhere near the Ahr. The bridge was just a Thursday. But that Thursday changed the math. Before Remagen, Allied planners estimated the Rhine crossing would take 3 weeks of preparation, cost 15,000 casualties, and require simultaneous assaults at 5 points to divide German defenses. The bridgehead eliminated all of that. Montgomery's Operation Plunder, launched on March 23rd, was a masterpiece of planning. 2,000 guns, 75,000 men, smokescreens laid by heavy bombers, airborne drops behind the river to seal the exits. It went exactly according to plan, with casualties far lower than projected. But by the time Plunder kicked off, the 9th Armored had already been on the far side for over 2 weeks. The war didn't end because of Remagen, but it accelerated. The bridgehead allowed Hodge's 1st Army to encircle the Ruhr from the south, while Simpson's 9th Army hooked north, trapping Model's Army Group B in a pocket that surrendered on April 18th. 300,000 men walked into captivity, the largest mass surrender of German forces in the war. Without the bridge, that encirclement takes longer, costs more, drags into May. With the bridge, it's over in 5 weeks. The calculus shifts in other ways, too. With the Rhine crossed early, Eisenhower could push east faster, could reach the Elbe before the Soviets took Berlin, could occupy more of central Germany before the demarcation lines were drawn. The Cold War map gets redrawn, slightly, in ways that matter to Leipzig and Erfurt and 100 smaller towns that ended up on one side of the fence instead of the other. Not because of grand strategy, because a lieutenant ran across a bridge. Timmermann survived the war. He came home in July 1945, returned to Nebraska, and worked as a utility inspector for the next 40 years. He didn't talk much about Remagen. When journalists called, he was polite but brief. "We saw the bridge. We took it. That's all." He died in 1951 at age 36, from a heart condition the Army doctors attributed to stress. His obituary in the Lincoln Star mentioned the Distinguished Service Cross, but spent more words on his work with the local VFW post and his love of fishing. The Ludendorff was never rebuilt. After the collapse, the stone towers on both banks remained standing, too solid to demolish economically. The Americans used them as observation posts through the end of the war, then left them to the locals. In the 1970s, the West Tower was converted into a small museum dedicated to the bridge, to the crossing, to the 10 days when Remagen was the most important 100 yards in Europe. It's still there. The museum displays fragments of the original bridge, a steel rivet, a section of rail, photographs of the span half collapsed into the Rhine. There's a plaque listing the names of the 28 engineers who died on March 17th when the deck gave way and dropped them into the current. There's another plaque for Timmermann and one for Delizio, who followed him onto the span and survived the war by 3 months before dying in a traffic accident outside Fort Dix. And one for the platoon, all 36 names, with a note that 7 of them didn't make it home. The bridge itself is gone. The piers were removed in the 1970s because they disrupted river traffic, and now the Rhine flows clean over the spot where the center span once stood. On a clear day, if you stand on the esplanade where Timmermann's platoon crossed, you can see the far bank clearly, can trace the line where the rails used to run. It doesn't look like much, 85 feet of water, 200 yards of air. But in March 1945, that empty space was the difference between April and August, between a negotiated collapse and a total one, between a war that ended cleanly and one that bled into summer. One scout didn't follow orders, one bridge didn't fall, and the arithmetic of the endgame changed in 10 minutes. History doesn't usually work that way. It's glaciers and momentum, not hinge moments and lucky breaks. Scholars spend careers arguing about inevitability, about whether individual actions matter in the face of industrial logistics and strategic mass. The answer is usually no. Wars are won by factories and fuel and the weight of accumulated advantage, not by moments of improvisation. But sometimes the glaciers crack, sometimes the current shifts, sometimes a lieutenant with 36 men and no air support decides to run across a bridge because it's there, because waiting means losing it, because the book says to ask permission, but the book didn't account for this. Timmermann made a decision at 4:02 p.m. on a Thursday in March. The rest followed. Not because he was reckless or brilliant or touched by fate, because he saw something that wouldn't wait, and he moved. The engineers on the far side saw the same thing. They pulled the plunger. The difference is that one side's explosives worked better than the others, and that gap between intention and execution, between what should have happened and what did, became the gap between victory delayed and victory delivered. War is full of those gaps. Most of them close the wrong way. Most of the time, the charges work, the bridge drops, the defenders get another week, another month, and the casualties mount while the planners draw up contingencies and the factories churn out more landing craft and the calendar slides toward summer. This one didn't. The Ludendorff held for 10 minutes longer than it should have, and that was enough. The Rhine wasn't crossed by genius or overwhelming force. It was crossed by a lieutenant who didn't wait for orders and a bridge that didn't fall when it was supposed to. Sometimes that's all it takes. One decision, one moment, one shortcut that shouldn't have worked but did. And 80,000 men walk across a river that was supposed to be a wall. The museum in Remagen tries to capture that. The exhibits walk you through the day, hour by hour, with maps and photographs and personal accounts from both sides. There's a section on Bradge, on the court-martial, on the 5 men shot for failing to destroy what the corrosion destroyed for them. There's a section on the engineers who died when the span collapsed, on the weight they carried working on a bridge that everyone knew was failing, but that had to be kept open anyway, because the war didn't stop for metal fatigue. And there's a section on Timmermann, on the platoon, on the 10 minutes that changed the map. The exhibits are careful, balanced, respectful to both sides. They don't make heroes or villains. They present the facts, the times, the distances, the decisions, and let visitors draw their own conclusions. But standing in the tower, looking through the window at the empty river, you can still feel the weight of it. The 10 minutes when everything hung on steel and stone, and the will of 36 men who ran when every manual said to wait. They didn't wait. The bridge held, and the war came to an end a little faster because a scout took a shortcut no map would have recommended and no plan would have authorized. That's the story. Not of brilliance, of timing, of a moment when hesitation would have meant watching the span drop into the current, watching the chance dissolve, watching the calendar stretch into summer while the factories burned and the cities died and the soldiers kept dying for a conclusion everyone could see coming. Timmermann didn't hesitate. The bridge didn't fall. And in the gap between what was planned and what happened, 80,000 men crossed a river that was supposed to hold until late March, that was supposed to require airborne drops and artillery barrages, and 3 divisions hitting simultaneously under smoke. None of that was needed. A platoon ran across. The rest followed. March 7th, 1945. 3:50 p.m., 1 stone bridge, 1 platoon. One decision that closed the gap and opened the road and changed the speed at which the end arrived. The bridge is gone now. The river flows clean. But the towers still stand, watching the water, marking the place where 36 men decided that a shortcut was worth the risk. And a Thursday in March became the day the Rhine stopped being a barrier and became just another river.